I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about, can you hear me okay? Okay. About meaningful engagement of children in the court process. There was a study done in Lancaster County, actually by Vicki Weiss and some others, that asked children about their feelings about attending court hearings. And that study showed us that in general they had more positive feelings about the court process after they attended the hearings, and that there was really no evidence of distress. And the initiative we've visited this subject before about the importance of having them in attendance. So some of this is going to be a review for you, and you may have a pamphlet, I don't know if I brought mine up here, in front of you, that one, yep, that most of this information and some reference material is in. So I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, and then we want to have just a little bit of a discussion about having kids in court and talk about some of the barriers to that. So I started with this quote about remembering that the child welfare proceedings are about the child, and a child who comes to court should not be invisible. I think one of the important reasons to have kids in court is for us to remember why we're there. I think we get caught up in a lot of things, and I know even when I was a therapist, I got caught up in my paperwork and Magellan and all of these other things, and I had to bring myself back and remind myself that I was there to serve my client, which was the child. So I'm going to give you some general recommendations about having kids in court, and these are also in the pamphlet. One is to allow children to identify themselves on the record, and they may need some direction about how to do that. The more encouragement that kids got from judges, the better they felt about being there. So having them identify themselves, keeping your language simple and age appropriate, asking them for their youth court forms, I'm going to show you those in a minute, and allowing them to ask questions. We also want to observe their appearance and their interactions with other people, encourage them in providing feedback, and when possible, define things or provide them with a list of definitions. And then always thank them for coming. I'm going to go through kind of 3 developmental stages, 3, it's cut in 3. The older youth, I'm going to show you a video because I think they can probably tell it better about how they feel about having kids in court than I could do justice. So some of you may have seen this before.
And then when it finally happened, I found out that they had already had it and I never went.
I feel like there were some things that some people were lying about that they didn't want me to hear. After a while I found out, after I read all my reports, that some things was put in there that I never even heard of.
You know you want to be there because you want to tell the judge yourself how you feel, because as everybody knows, you pass information through so many people, and by the time it gets to where it's supposed to be going, things get worded wrong.
A lot of my court hearings were discontinued due to the fact that my mom and dad and their lawyers were never prepared.
Me and my judge have a pretty good connection, so I'm really honest and open with him.
I mean, you hold their destiny in your hands, and when you give them a chance to talk, that's huge to a lot of kids.
There was one conversation that my brother and I had with our guardian ad litem before court, but I think that was just when we met.
Most of my conversations before the hearing with my guardian ad litem were not really conversations. It was like, "Hi, how are you?" And I was like, "Good." And then it was kind of, "Oh, well, we're going to be going in a few minutes." And it was never like, "Is there anything we need to work on?"
My CASA is very supportive of everything I do.
My CASA volunteer, I talked to her not only before court hearings, but in between. She was always very helpful. She made sure if there was something that I wanted the judge to hear from me and I, couldn't say it, because it's intimidating, you forget things. She made sure that the judge heard what I had to say.
But with my caseworker, usually we talk about just how I felt about what was said and stuff. And sometimes it's even nice because she'll take me out to a coffee shop.
They'll usually say, we have another court hearing around 6 months, and then they'll just walk away and talk to other people.
Of course, I think kids should be able to attend their hearings. I mean, it's about their welfare.
Yes, I do believe that they should attend their own court hearings because it's their life. This is the one time where everyone just lays out in front of them, okay, this is what I think, this is what's happened the past couple months. I think you need to know. So it's really unfair to them that they miss it and they still have no idea what's going on in their life.
I think maybe we don't want to hear those things, but we should, because in my case, I have heard things about my dad and how he's not doing what he should be doing. And it does hurt, but it also makes you realize just how much you shouldn't be there. And it really opens your eyes up to who you don't want to be like.
Just the fact that they don't think they know or they don't think they're at the right age, but usually kids pick up on things that are going on. So it's better to be honest with them and let them know than try to hide it from them and let them worry about it.
I think the thing she said in the last is often a thing that we worry about, kids coming to court and that they're going to hear things that are upsetting to them. And I will tell you, when I was in practice as a therapist, what the kids would say to me about things like that is that they lived that experience, so they knew about it. And I think you heard on the video when they were saying, they would have rather that someone had been honest with them about what was going on, rather than kind of having this veiled process where people were telling them everything's going okay. Well, then why am I not having parenting time? Why am I, why are these things happening? So a lot of those experiences they lived. One of the ways for older youth, if they can't attend court, is the youth court form. And in your packet, you have a copy of this. And also on the Through the Eyes website, it's a downloadable PDF. And this was developed with judges and Project Everlast. And the content's been updated. We're hoping that soon it will be web-based, so that the kids are able to go on and fill out this form and then submit it that way instead of having to mail it in. But I think it provides a couple things. It provides them with input, and then it also, if you notice on the back page, there's some of that language, some of that information about what is a court order, what is a team meeting, what is your guardian ad litem. So it gives kind of a short definition when it's asking the questions. So I think this is a really helpful document. How many of you are seeing this? A few? Okay. So we'd like to see this more frequently, and the kids can, they can bring it to court with them and you can talk with them about it. I'm going to have some of you share your experiences with having kids in court. So if you want to talk about how you do that in your court, that would be great. You can also ask them questions. And I think if you ask them a yes or no question, this age group, you're going to get a yes or no answer. So when I was a therapist, frequently the phrase I used was "tell me about." And you can fill in with any of these things. Tell me about your friends. Tell me about how it goes when you go to see your parents. Tell me about your favorite thing at school. Tell me about things that are going well. And that leaves it open for them to talk instead of just saying, I don't know, I don't remember, I don't know, yes. Just recently, we developed the Young Child Court Form. And this is for use with kids developmentally ages 6 to 10 probably. We didn't put an age group on it because we thought, there may be some kids that are younger than that can have this filled out. There may be older kids that would prefer to fill this one out. It's also in your packet, and Kelly Inquist helped design this and make it colorful because it's for little kids. And we tried to use language that was more developmentally appropriate. There's drawing on it. We have just finished this, so the only time we've used it is Kids and Judges Day in Douglas County. Some kids filled it out, and then we moved a few things around on the form, gave it a little bit more room some places, but generally the response has been really good to this. So this is a way that those kids can come and bring this information if they're nervous, or they can submit it if they're not able to attend court. I think probably the newest part of what we're going to be discussing today is having young children in court. And as Judge Gendler mentioned, I was part of a project, a federal grant called Project Safe Start Nebraska. And we provided coordination and child-parent psychotherapy to kids 5 and under in the family treatment drug courts. And one of the things that happened because we were in family treatment drug court and because we were talking about babies is that we tended to have those kids come to court, which was maybe a little bit unusual because people don't think about the value of having a baby in court because they can't participate. But I would tell you that I think behavior has meaning, and you can gain a lot from having those kids in court. You can see how the child interacts with their parent, with caregivers, with strangers. You can see how they are developmentally. There's an app called the Staying on Track, or you can use the developmental wheel. And that way, if you know how old the child is, you know the things they should be able to do. So for example, these are all things that would be observable in your courtroom. If you knew the child was 9 to 12 months, you could see if they could do all of these things. You could probably observe that. What we wanted to do today was set up a foundation for us just to have a discussion about the value of having kids in court. And in particular, maybe having young kids in court because there hasn't been a lot of that. So I'm going to call on some of my family drug court judges to maybe give some examples of times where you've had kids in court. Do you want to start? When you had them in court, or what do you think the value was of having them?
Well, we tended to have them at our on weekly or biweekly conferences. Parents, the first thing that was always noticeable was the first time that they appeared. The parents were extremely eager to bring them to the front of the court and show everyone else their children. And I don't remember any instance where there wasn't an observable bond between the parent and the child, even though the basis for removal may have been egregious. But
can you talk about how you maybe talk about dealing with young kids in court? I think one of the barriers that we've heard is that they're little and they get up and they run around and they're loud and they're smelly and they do all of these things.
As a complaint?
Yes, as a complaint.
I don't know that there's any right way or wrong way to handle them. You have to understand that that's their stage in life at that particular time, and if they have to run around, they run around, and I always try to encourage parents. You can get up and move around with them. You don't have to try to keep them quiet. I understand my court reporter has a much different view than I, because the first thing that is obvious is the microphones with the little foam coverings that are like candy to them, and that's the first thing they want to do is grab those and start talking into them or dragging them around. So she's always cringing, but those things are replaceable, so I don't have a big problem with it.
And I think it does remind us that that's normal developmentally for them to throw tantrums. Judge Heidemann didn't talk about the story, but he did have a little girl up on the bench with him who, when he got ready to set her down, she was a very serious little girl. And I think what we saw was a change in her attachment. And we saw some healing that was going on because she didn't normally go up to the bench. And we were several months in, and she left her mom to go up there and wander. And then he thought he was going to put her down, and she thought otherwise. And she reminded us all what 3-year-olds look like. And we're all standing around. I'm like the infant and toddler expert standing there going, oh, the kid's having a tantrum. But since he was a grandpa, he knew what to do, and he picked her back up, and we gave her what she wanted. And things went fine the rest of the court hearing. So, Alicia, can you wait for the mic? Sorry. Well, we're taping, so we want to make sure we get your comments on tape.
I have to hold both of them. Wow. One of the things so I'm a county attorney, and it was a very interesting experience that we had, and it was a drug court, and I think it was a staffing. Is this really on? Okay, I'll talk into this one, which has no microphone on it at all, but apparently it'll help with the camera. There we go. Thank you. Put it really close to my mouth. Did that help? What you got? Like a special. It's not going. Okay, I'll just talk really loud. It was a drug court staffing, but it was when the judge was not there. It was early on in some of our youth are working with the CPP program, so the Child Parent Psychotherapy program, and it was an infant. And we had learned enough about sort of the interaction and the kinds of things that we should expect between a parent and a young infant, that when this mom brought the child in, she was holding the child face away from us, or face away from her, never once looked at the child, and the child was just like, literally, this little baby was just looked like she was a traumatized child. So from my point of view, it was very, very, very helpful to see what needed to be repaired in this child's life, because she clearly did not have a bond with her mother, and clearly was, just showed being petrified. And it was a domestic violence case also involving drugs.
Right, and I think in that particular case, another thing we saw was the more upset mom became, the more upset the baby became, which reminded us all about the importance of repairing that. Mom has to learn to regulate herself and be okay in order for her to take care of the baby. Judge, did you want to share your thoughts?
I love having Well, the family drug court's the most fun time of the week, and it's always fun when the moms and dads bring the kids, and they often do because the kids are placed with them. Jenny's provided boxes of books. I'm running low, by the way.
Okay.
So there's always books for them to read, and they'll come sit with me in my lap while we're doing the hearing, or we get down and hold them, or you can see them interact. Remember, Angela's daughter that we discovered was delayed, and it was due to mom's drug use, but without actually seeing this child who was just 2 or 3, and seeing her interact with her mom. It just gave you a whole different picture of what her needs were, and mom's difficulty understanding what the child's needs were. But it's great fun, and I think it's important for the kids at any age, because they know their parents are working in this special court, this drug court, and they know there's a judge involved, and to be able to see that it's not a punitive interaction, that it's supportive, and I really think that's meaningful for the kids, especially when they come to graduation as well.
Right.
But you have to remind me the story about the girl in the shoes.
Well, I was
forgot
asking her to
that one.
tell the story. Judge was wearing pink high heels, and if you all know me, I like shoes, so I would have noticed. And the little girl said, "Can I wear your shoes?" And she took them off. Once again, proving that the smaller they are, the more control they probably have in your courtroom. And she just kind of tromped around while we were talking in her shoes. But it was a very friendly place for her to be, and I think nice for us to see, the interaction, and remember again that she's little, so that's what was developmentally appropriate.
Of course, there was the one mom who had 2 older kids, and she had a baby while we were working with her.
Yeah.
Great, born without drugs in her system. But when she brought the baby to court, I got off the bench and I said, "Can I hold your baby?" And she just held that baby close to her. And we all
Great.
laughed. I said, it was not, no one was offended. We just knew that it took her a while. A few months
She
later,
did eventually, though,
yeah.
let you hold the baby, but
did.
yeah, she was not too keen on.
Yeah.
Although then we had to have a discussion because we have drug court staffing, so we were able to, and this is what happens when therapists come to your staffings, we had to process why she would not let Judge hold the baby. But I do think it was telling that she still had some kind of insecurities about that, yeah.
Absolutely, and we laughed about it. And,
Yeah.
and you're right, we were able to work on it and
Before I pass the mic to Judge Gendler to talk a little bit, I did bring an example for older children. Judge Van Pola couldn't be with us, but this was a traditional courtroom. And then he has set up a courtroom here where he has proceedings where he's able to sit with older kids and their families and use that to engage them. So he sits next to them. He leaves his robe on, he says, to remind them that he's the judge. But he was talking about how he could tell how the proceedings were going by where people were sitting when he came in. If they were both sitting on the ends of the table, he knew that they had quite a bit of work to do. And if they were sitting at the middle of the table together, that it was going better. He also talked about making sure that he got to sit right across from or next to the kid, even if they moved around. But that's an example maybe for older youth, a way that he's been able to engage them. And then I was going to let Judge Gendler share. He's having kids in chambers. So.
Yeah, just briefly, we email the attorneys and get permission ahead of time, but we've had youngsters bring their youth court questionnaires with them, and we have the luxury of having court reporters. So they come into the chambers in our office. You know, we're on the record. The guardian ad litem is present. The CASA, if there's a CASA available, is also present. And I just go through the youth court questionnaires with them, ask them questions about school, how their summer went. We don't talk a lot of substance, obviously, because we have to save that for the courtroom. But they get a lot out of it, and a lot of their questions relate to the process more than the substance. Although we did have something unique last month where I had just found out from them that the foster parent was under investigation for abuse, and they had to be moved to another foster home. And at the time, they had had supervised visits with their mother, but they wanted to go home. And they were told they were going to another foster home. So as a result of that meeting with them, I had the attorneys meet, and we ended up with a safety plan where the kids actually went back home at that court hearing. And I don't think that would have happened but for the fact that those kids came to court. So it's something we're going to try and do more of.
Thanks. You know, and this is our 4th regional conference, so we've done this several times, and we've tried to kind of talk about what the barriers were and why kids weren't coming to court. Because how many of you are routinely seeing kids in court? It's just a couple hands. And so what we had a hard time getting into, and we can might be more comfortable in your team discussions, but if we wanted to talk about it a little bit now, is what are the barriers to getting them there? Is it transportation? Do you want to talk about some of the barriers?
I have though I really don't need a microphone. One quick story, when I've had a child in court brought by a CASA with the agreement of the parties, who came and talked to me, and then as she was leaving, she told her CASA, he's not nearly as mean as Judge Judy. So, but in my case, it was true. I think one of the barriers in getting, first of all, I think I have one caution, and the one caution is that kids in court need to be based on the needs of those children.
Yep.
I've had teenagers who absolutely did not want to come to court because they didn't want to see their parents, and there were therapeutic reasons that they needed to deal with therapeutically those issues rather than have to come to court and be afraid of some kind of confrontation with their parents. As for, I absolutely believe in 99% of the cases, teenagers need to be there if they can. And younger children if they express a need. And certainly I'm open to having children of all ages there under those circumstances. But I just want to say there are circumstances in which kids should not be in court for various reasons because it doesn't meet their needs. I think some barriers, if we go on to the barriers issue, is that one of the barriers is it's problematic for the worker. The worker has to go pick them up. They have to figure out the time with the foster parent, or the foster parent has to be here. So there's lots of logistic issues that come into play, particularly with younger children, and trying to just make the logistics work. I also think in terms of if you're going to be basing this on the needs of kids, judges need to hear from the parties involved that these kids should be here. So guardians ad litem, CASAs, and others should be expressing that this child needs to come to court. and wants to come to court. And I think that will be very helpful if there's that kind of communication before a court hearing, because that allows me to make an order if I need to, or certainly make arrangements with the department or others to make sure that child is present. So that's really what I want to say.
Yeah, and I think certainly there's discretion. There's a reason you have discretion, because there are certain cases or certain hearings that maybe a child shouldn't be present at. But I think the presumption from the evidence that we have is that it's helpful for them to be there, and we don't really have anything to the contrary yet. So the presumption that they should be there unless there's a good reason that they shouldn't be. But did you? Oh.
I know a few years ago we made it a rule to bring the kids to court all the time in Lancaster County is where I practice mostly. And it seemed like it started tapering off fairly quickly after we started that. But it seemed like when we were doing, having the kids come to court, a lot of times, as guardian ad litem, I guess it would be me, would say, I think we should excuse the kids for this next section. I saw what the young woman said about, well, we know our parents have problems, but I don't think that they always know exactly the depth or the progress or lack thereof that a parent is making. For example, we have a case right now where there's been a supplemental motion filed to terminate parental rights of a father, and the allegation is that he sexually perpetrated upon a stepbrother. I've not told those girls that we believe your father sexually perpetrated on this other person. So, I mean, there's a lot of times that I think you really can't have the kids there, and I also think it's harmful for them to hear what, the progress or lack thereof that parents are making.
I think that there are certainly times that things would not be appropriate, and I think it would be appropriate, for a judge to explain, we're going to talk about some things, thank you for coming, I'm going to have you step out. Vicki and I were just talking about this so that the child knows that we're not all talking about them at that point, and do some preparation there. But since I practiced as a therapist, what I got from older kids especially, is I ended up explaining all those things that you're talking about right now in therapy would end up becoming an issue, that I would have to explain what happened in a court hearing because the worker would say, well, this happened or that happened. And the kids felt very out of the loop and kind of out of control because they had no input. They weren't there. They didn't get to, express an opinion, and they weren't brought in. So it was all of this stuff happening behind the scenes that they weren't able, to talk about, that we had to process afterwards. And I think that made an extra layer for them. But
I think the perception, when you say, okay, we've talked about all the happy things, you're doing well in school, everything going okay with you at the foster parent's house, and then, okay, you've got to leave because we've got to talk about other things. It almost was more harmful to go that way than it was.
But I'm not proposing that you just talk about the happy things. I think that developmentally, if it's done developmentally appropriately, and you can talk about with kids things they're not happy. Like I said, most of these kids know these things are going on, and sometimes it's better to have an answer than to let them dream up what the answer is. I will tell you, when I practiced as a therapist, there were a lot of kids that were under the impression that they weren't having parenting time because their parents didn't want to see them. It had nothing to do with, no one had ever sat them down and explained, your mom's in drug treatment and, she's working through these issues and she's trying really hard, and it's not that she doesn't want to see you. Those things weren't explained to them, so they're going to make up an answer. They're going to figure it out. And kids are really egocentric, and the answer almost always, unless you explain it to them, is going to be, it's my fault. And that's not the perception we want them to have. We don't want them to think that things are happening because of them. So,
I have a lot of teenage girls or boys that they would really like to go home no matter what.
Right.
Because in foster care, there's a whole lot of rules, and they've, for the most part, lived without rules for most of their lives. So where do you see that?
Well, I think if you note at the top of even the young child court form, and I did get this question from a guardian ad litem, it's a good opportunity to talk with kids about what they want and what might really happen. And in my office, we used to talk about, because kids would know that their parents were going to have a court hearing, and they would say, I want to go home, or my mom told me that I'm coming home after this. And we would have the discussion about there may be things that you want, and all of those things may not happen because other people, a whole team of people is talking about what's best for you. And when I had little kids, I'd always use the example, like I want to eat ice cream all day long and eat nothing else, but that's not good for me. And so, there are ways of talking with kids about we want your opinion and we want your input. It doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen, but we want to know what you think and we want to know how you feel about this process. And I think that's what probably increases their trust in the court process is they have that input and they're able to talk about what they think and what they feel, knowing that that's not necessarily what's going to happen. That has to be set up. The young child court form is to be filled out with somebody else helping them, whether it be a CASA, a guardian ad litem, or we talked about maybe a school counselor, anyone that they trust, a foster parent, possibly helping them fill it out. But there's some language right at the top and a discussion needs to be had with kids, and I think with older kids too, that, this is because we want to know what you think and feel, not because we're going to do what you write down on the paper. Thank you. I think this is good to have this discussion.
Well, I was just going to point out, I have really no problem with having kids in court, and I really encourage it. One thing that happens sometimes is if you don't have somebody there that can take the child out of the courtroom, particularly young children that are rambunctious and excited to see their parents and whatever, the parent is really distracted. And if you are on a 6-month review hearing, and this is your 45 minutes to have a hearing with the parents, if they're distracted by a 3-year-old that is constantly talking and playing with them and whatever, I feel like the parent is sort of cheated of the opportunity to really focus on what they need to. So ideally in that situation, you've got somebody that can take the child outside and read some books to them or something. And a lot of times there isn't anybody there.
You can go get Judge Heidemann and he will come hold the baby for you. Wow.
CASA's been great about that, but a lot of times that piece is missing, and it'd be nice if it was there.
Yeah, I think that definitely is. Somebody's got to be available to take the child out if they want to be taken out too. They may want to leave. So.
Or they may not want
to. Or they may not want to leave. Okay.
One thing that just struck me is in terms of what the judge can consider. And as we had this discussion regarding bonding and how the child reacts to the parent, that's not evidence. So should we be, as judges, utilizing what we see in the courtroom as far as how they interact with each other and whether they appear to be bonded, when that hasn't been presented as formal evidence to us in making our ultimate court orders? I just think it raises that issue. So,
do you want to, since that was your comment, do you want to speak to it? No, Oh, okay. Does anybody want to speak to it? I'm here to talk to you about your feelings. I'm the therapist, not the lawyer.
In the drug court context, we're all observing it as a team, and it's not evidence.
It's something that we can talk about as a team in terms of our observations, and the defense is there and the county attorney, and maybe Rachel, where are you? Hiding? She's hiding. Oh, do you have any thoughts on that?
Rachel.
You can be honest.
I think at least in our drug court, I think most of the kids that are there are quite a bit younger, but I think they're pretty aware of what everything's happening as far as what's going on with their parents, and they're pretty aware that they're there because of drug issues. It gets a little bit stickier, I think, as everyone else was saying, with some of the routine cases where they're not coming in for reviews as often and they're not in front of the court, where the kids are coming in and kind of getting hit with 6 months of this is what's been going on with my parent's case. And I think more often than not, they do get excused for part of it, because especially the cases that have been going on long, those are usually ones that have the pretty severe complications. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag, but if you have a case where, like I said, there's pretty constant contact, it seems to be a lot more comfortable for the kids than anything else.
You know, in answer to Bob's question, I think that the one thing Jenny that we had, where I talked about
It wasn't a matter of observing the child and making my own conclusions. It was a matter of, we had been reading the reports, all of us, they were offered into evidence about the needs of the child, and so it was a visualization of what was already in evidence and in the record. I didn't mean to suggest that the court is reaching its own conclusions about bonding and things like that. Nevertheless, a judge hears the witnesses, a judge observes the witnesses, a judge determines veracity, those types of things. So those are not, except they're under, I'm not fighting with you. I just, well, it's an,
is to look at that bonding and say, oh, that's wonderful, they're really doing great, when it actually hasn't been evidence to present to suggest that same thing.
So you're right on. It's
wonder more than anything else.
Right, and interesting, kind of like, do the kids stay for the whole hearing, or do you remove them for part of the hearing? It's important to have those questions and to have them in your mind so that common sense can prevail at different times.
Right, or, I mean, the third option is, Judge Gendler was talking about having kids in chambers and then ask them to come in hearing. I think Vicki and then Judge Heidemann, and then I saw somebody over here.
I just wanted to respond, to get off the legal issue, but get back to the feeling.
Get back to
thing.
feelings.
With the concern about if really stressful or bad stuff is going to happen, and a couple of things. I think obviously discretion and allegations that are about sexual conduct or whatever that don't involve the child, especially if it's not known yet, they might not know, and you certainly don't want them to learn about that in court. So I think there are exceptions, but just a couple of stories. One is that at our 2 summits ago, when we had a whole track on children coming to court, Judge Thorson was in the courtroom, and one of the young women there, a former foster youth, said to her that, well, my case was in your court, and I wasn't going, but then I eventually got to go. And until I went to court, my mother kept talking about how Judge Thorson was this evil witch and wouldn't let me come home, and my mother said she was doing everything right and she was going to treatment and blah, 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 and it was this bad judge. And then I did finally get to go to a hearing, and I learned that my mother wasn't actually in treatment and had dropped out. And even though it was painful, so it was upsetting to hear that, I needed to know that. And I just had then, my coping with what was going on, it was just a completely different situation. So that's one thing. I think that sometimes parents, believe it or not, might not be completely upfront to their children about what happens in court, and the children might get the view that the judge is lightly making decisions that are really unfair to the child. And it is important for children, I think, to believe that the court is doing its best to make the decisions that are best for the children, even if the child might want something else. So that's one. The other thing is, in the research that Jenny alluded to that we did, there were a few, part of the research, children were observed right before they went into court, and then right when they came out, they weren't observed, they had a quickie assessment. And there were a few children that when they came out of court were crying. And on the sad, happy face thing or whatever the tool was, they were not happy. They were upset. But we also had a follow-up that was a week to 10 days later, and all of the children who were upset when they came out of court said it was upsetting, but I'm really glad I was there, and I needed to be there. And so I think it's important. I mean, 20 years ago there was a belief that children should not be taken to funerals, even of their parents, because it would be too upsetting for them. And now we know that, yes, it will be very upsetting to them, because the upsetting part is that their mother died. It's, the funeral just makes it worse. And I think in our worry about seeing them cry or whatever, I think sometimes we may not, recognize that they actually do have a need to know what's going on and would like to have a voice, even if they know they can't get their way in what's going on. So, thank you.
Right. I think Judge Heidemann had a comment. I think for some kids, that's part of their integrating the trauma that's happened, is to attend the hearing, to know what's going on, and be part of that experience.
Jenny, since I've already identified yourself as a therapist, here's I think what a lot of people may struggle with, at least I do. Get pretty comfortable with the young children who may be not very verbal or able to comprehend a lot of what's going on, and comfortable with the older kids because they have a pretty good understanding. But it's that group of those middle kids, I think you've identified maybe that 6 to 10 age frame, of being asked that question and knowing what's the right amount of information to give and what's too much information to give that kind of regresses them.
Right. And I think that's something that you need to expect. And we were talking about this earlier too, that when they come, to expect that's probably the hardest question you're going to be asked. And to think about in terms of how much they need to know and how much they don't need to know. When kids ask me that age always in my office why they couldn't go home, I would say there are things that your mom or your dad need to do so that you can be a safe family. And maybe I would give them 1 or 2 examples. They need to go to some classes, or they need to go talk to a person like me because they need to make some different choices. And when they do that, then we can talk about you going home. But that limited bit of information also helped them feel like there's a reason we're not together, not just someone came and snatched me out of my home and I don't know why I'm not there, and someone's doing something about it to make it better. And so I think that part was helpful. But I do think that's difficult for anybody, to be asked those questions. And we talked about, I think maybe we don't put it up here, but some of the reasons that it's difficult to have kids in court is because we are then faced with those difficult questions and kind of wondering if we're going to say the right things and worrying about re-traumatizing children when they come to court. But I would say again that just having been working with kids in my office for over a decade, they knew what was going on. They saw most of the things that you all didn't think they saw. In fact, they probably knew more than we knew. I would have kids that knew when their parents were using drugs again because they were able to identify changes in their behavior that maybe I didn't pick up on. And so I think, using age-appropriate language is important and not giving too much information, but recognizing that they've lived this life and that they're in this process with their parent. I think the recognition of those 2 things helps.
Jenny, what do you say to the children when it is meth, that's the reason of the removal?
When their parents have been using drugs?
Because that's the majority of our community.
Yeah, and kids will ask that. And I always talked with kids about, your mom or dad has a problem, and that they are, we talked about addiction in terms of they sometimes take things called drugs, and most kids are familiar with drugs are for school. If you ask my kids who are 8, 9, and 10, they could tell you all about it, including I had a little girl one time that I thought they were doing really well, and we're sitting there and we're talking, and she said, last night I saw my mom use drugs, and I thought, oh my God, I thought you were doing well. She said she was smoking cigarettes. So sometimes you have to check in on things, but I would talk with them about, drugs are bad for your body and you don't make very good decisions. And when your mom or dad is using drugs, they don't make very good decisions and they can't take very good care of you. And that's why you have to stay with somebody else until they can, stop using drugs. But that's hard. It's hard to stop using drugs. So.